There is a spacecraft sitting on the surface of the moon right now. It has been there for more than 50 years. It is not moving. It is not transmitting. It is not being monitored by anyone. It is just sitting there, in the stillness and the vacuum and the ancient gray dust of the lunar surface, exactly where it was left, exactly as it was left, untouched by weather, because there is no weather, undisturbed by animals, because there are no animals, unvisited by humans, because humans have not been back, a piece of extraordinary human achievement, resting in an environment so hostile and so permanent that nothing about it will change for millions of years. And here is the thing that stops you when you think about it long enough. Nobody owns it. Nobody has legal authority over it. Nobody has the right to move it, touch it, dismantle it, preserve it, claim it, or decide what happens to it next. It exists in a legal void as complete and as strange as the physical void surrounding it. The most remote human artifact in existence is also, in a very precise and deliberate legal sense, the most ungoverned object that has ever existed. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the world the way it actually works. Not the version you get in a headline, but the real version, the version with depth and history, and the kind of strangeness that makes you stop and reconsider things you thought were settled. Let us go. The spacecraft we are talking about is not a single object. It is several. There are multiple lunar landers and descent stages, and rovers and assorted pieces of equipment scattered across the surface of the moon, left behind by the Apollo missions and by the robotic precursor missions that came before and after them. But the one that concentrates the legal and philosophical questions most sharply, the one that has become the symbolic center of a genuinely fascinating debate about ownership and heritage and the future of space exploration, is the Apollo 11 descent stage. The lower half of the lunar module Eagle, the part that stayed behind when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin lifted off from the lunar surface on July 21, 1969, and is still sitting in the Sea of Tranquility, exactly where they left it, right now, as you are reading this, as you are listening to this, unchanged and unchanging and belonging to no one. To understand why this matters, and why it matters more with every passing year, we need to understand how the legal framework of space was constructed, and we need to understand it in some detail, because the details are where the real strangeness lives. The year is 1967. The Cold War is at one of its most intense phases. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union is not yet resolved. Both superpowers are projecting capabilities into space at a pace that is making diplomats and legal scholars and political philosophers genuinely nervous. Because the existing frameworks of international law, built around the concept of national sovereignty over territory, have no obvious answers for what happens when nations start operating in a domain that has no historical precedent as a human environment. The sea has laws. The air has laws. Even Antarctica, as remote and uninhabitable as it is, has a treaty regime. But space is something else. Space is something new, in a way that even Antarctica is not, because Antarctica is at least on the same planet, reachable in principle, subject to the same atmosphere, part of the same ecosystem, of a world that humans evolved to inhabit. Space is genuinely other, and the question of what rules apply in genuinely other places is not a question that existing law had any ready answer for. The treaty that emerged from this anxiety is called the Outer Space Treaty, and it was opened for signature in January of 1967 and entered into force in October of the same year. It has since been ratified by most of the world's spacefaring nations, including the United States, Russia, China, the European nations, and more than 100 others. It is the foundational document of international space law, the bedrock on which everything else in this domain rests, and it contains several provisions that are of direct relevance to our question. The most important provision, the one that everything else flows from, is Article 2. It is a short article. It reads, in its entirety, outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. 6 words carry the weight of it. Not subject to national appropriation. No country can own the moon. No country can plant a flag and mean it legally, whatever the political symbolism of the gesture. No country can claim territory, establish sovereignty, or treat any portion of the lunar surface as falling within its national domain. This is extraordinary when you think about it. In the entire history of international law, in the centuries of treaties and conventions and agreements about who owns what, and who has authority over whom, and where one nation's jurisdiction ends and another's begins. There is almost no parallel for this kind of categorical exclusion of territorial sovereignty. The deep seabed, as established by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, has a similar character, designated as the common heritage of mankind. But even there, the framework includes international institutions with management authority. The Outer Space Treaty, in its foundational provision, says simply that no one owns the moon, and leaves the consequences of that statement to be worked out in the details that follow. And the details that follow are where our story lives. Article 5Y of the Outer Space Treaty addresses the question of ownership of objects in space. And here the treaty does something interesting. It separates the question of territorial sovereignty, which it has already answered with a categorical no, from the question of ownership of objects, which it answers very differently. Article 5II states that a state party to the treaty retains jurisdiction and control over objects it launches into space, and over personnel on such objects, regardless of where those objects are located, including, crucially, if they land on another celestial body, including, crucially, if they are left behind. So here is the paradox, and it is a genuine paradox, not a rhetorical one. The United States owns the Apollo 11 descent stage. It retains jurisdiction and control over it, under the clear language of the treaty. But the United States does not and cannot own the ground beneath it. It cannot declare the area around it to be United States territory. It cannot establish a perimeter of national sovereignty around it. It cannot, in the formal sense of international law, tell another nation's spacecraft not to land near it, not to drive past it, not to approach it. The object belongs to the United States. The place where the object sits belongs to no one. This would be a curious but mostly academic legal puzzle, a footnote in international law textbooks, except for the fact that the moon is no longer the exclusive preserve of two superpowers with a mutual interest in avoiding nuclear annihilation and a corresponding willingness to agree on rules. The moon of 2024 is a destination that a rapidly expanding number of national space programs and private commercial entities are actively targeting. China landed a rover on the moon. India landed a spacecraft near the lunar South Pole. Japan has landed a spacecraft. Private companies including SpaceX and Blue Origin and United Launch Alliance and iSpace and Astrobotic and Intuitive Machines have lunar ambitions that range from specific near-term missions to long-term plans for lunar resource extraction, permanent crewed outposts, and eventually something that could reasonably be called lunar colonization. The moon is not a destination that humanity visited once in the late 1960s and early 1970s and then abandoned as a curiosity. It is a destination that humanity is actively preparing to return to at scale, with resources and commitments that dwarf the Apollo program in their long-term ambition, if not yet in their immediate drama. And when all of those missions start arriving, when the surface of the moon goes from being visited occasionally to being visited regularly, when spacecraft start touching down in areas of particular scientific or commercial or strategic interest, the legal and ethical questions that have been academic for 50 years start becoming very practical very quickly. The Sea of Tranquility, where the Apollo 11 descent stage sits, is not the most resource-rich location on the moon. The areas of greatest commercial interest to the companies and nations now racing to establish a lunar presence are the polar regions, particularly the South Pole, where there is water ice in permanently shadowed craters, water that can potentially be split into hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel, making the lunar South Pole a kind of cosmic gas station that could dramatically change the economics of deep space exploration. The North and South Poles are where the action is likely to be, not the equatorial landing sites of the Apollo missions. But the Apollo sites are not without interest. They are historically significant. They are scientifically significant because the equipment left behind by the Apollo missions, the retroreflectors that can still be pinged with laser pulses to measure the precise distance to the moon, the seismometers that operated for years before being shut down, the sample collection areas, constitute a record of early human activity on the moon that has scientific value in itself, as a baseline against which future measurements can be compared, as a record of the conditions of the early space age. And they are culturally significant in a way that is harder to quantify, but no less real, because the Apollo 11 landing site is where human beings first stood on another world, which is, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most significant events in the history of our species. The question of how to protect this significance, how to ensure that the Apollo sites are treated with something appropriate to their historical weight, is a question that has been generating serious discussion in the space law and space policy communities for decades now. And the answers that have been proposed are fascinating in themselves because they reveal the limits of our existing legal frameworks when applied to genuinely new situations. The most obvious potential solution would be to simply declare the Apollo landing sites UNESCO World Heritage Sites. This is the mechanism that international law has developed for protecting places of outstanding universal value, and the Apollo 11 landing site would seem to qualify on that criterion more obviously than almost anything else. Outstanding universal value, the place where humanity first left its home planet, the first footsteps of a species on another world. If that does not qualify as outstanding universal value, it is difficult to imagine what would. The problem is that the World Heritage Convention, like essentially all of the international legal frameworks that protect heritage sites, is built around the concept of territorial sovereignty. The UNESCO World Heritage List protects sites by imposing obligations on the nations that have sovereignty over the territory where the site is located. The nation agrees to manage and protect the site, submits reports on its condition, accepts peer review of its conservation practices. The entire mechanism depends on there being a nation with territorial sovereignty over the place where the site is located. And the Moon has no such nation, because the Outer Space Treaty said so in 1967, and the world agreed, and there is no obvious way to change that foundational provision without unraveling the entire framework of space law. So the World Heritage route is blocked, not because the Apollo sites are not significant enough, but because the legal structure of the protection mechanism is incompatible with the legal status of the Moon. NASA attempted to address this problem directly. In 2011, the agency published a document called NASA's Recommendations to Spacefaring Entities: How to Protect and Preserve the Historic and Scientific Value of U.S. Government Lunar Artifacts. It was a detailed and thoughtful document that identified the specific sites and artifacts of concern, described what kinds of activities might damage or disturb them, and recommended that other space missions plan their operations to avoid interference with the identified artifacts. It recommended, for instance, that visiting spacecraft not land within 2 kilometers of the Apollo 11 site, and not drive within 200 meters of it, to avoid disturbing the hardware with rocket plume or wheel tracks or any other physical interaction. It was a well-intentioned document. It was also completely unenforceable. NASA's recommendations are, by definition, recommendations. They have no legal force. They cannot compel any other nation or any private company to do anything. They are guidance that other actors can choose to follow or choose to ignore, and since there is no mechanism to enforce them, the choice is entirely that of the other actor. The United States government cannot, under the existing framework of international law, tell another nation's mission planner not to fly within 2 kilometers of the Apollo 11 site. It can ask, it can recommend, it can express concern through diplomatic channels, but it cannot prohibit. Because the ground is not American territory, and international law does not generally allow one nation to impose rules on other nations' activities in spaces that are not under anyone's sovereignty. The legal situation is in some ways even more complicated than this suggests, because the Outer Space Treaty itself is silent on the specific question of protecting the artifacts that spacefaring nations have left on celestial bodies. The treaty establishes that states retain ownership of their space objects, but it does not create any obligation on other states to avoid interfering with those objects. The closest the treaty comes to this is a provision in Article 9 that requires states to conduct their activities in outer space with due regard to the corresponding interests of all other states' parties. Due regard is a legal standard of some substance in international law, something more than no regard but considerably less than absolute protection. Whether another nation driving a rover past the Apollo 11 descent stage constitutes a failure of due regard is genuinely uncertain, and the answer almost certainly depends on what the rover does in the process of driving past. If a future mission, from any nation or any private company, were to approach the Apollo 11 site and accidentally or intentionally damage the descent stage, what would happen? This is not an abstract question. It is a question that lawyers and policymakers and space historians have been thinking about with increasing urgency as the pace of lunar exploration accelerates. The first answer is that it would depend on the circumstances. If a state-operated mission caused the damage, the United States would have recourse under the Liability Convention of 1972, another foundational document of international space law, which establishes that launching states are liable for damage caused by their space objects. The Liability Convention has actually been invoked once, in 1978, when a Soviet nuclear-powered satellite called Cosmos 954 broke up during re-entry and scattered radioactive debris across northern Canada. The Soviet Union ultimately paid a settlement to Canada, but the Liability Convention was designed primarily for damage caused on Earth and in orbit, and its application to damage caused on the lunar surface is legally uncertain. The convention does address damage on celestial bodies, but only for damage caused to another launching state's space objects. And the definition of damage and the standards of liability differ depending on whether you are on Earth, in space, or on a celestial body. If a private company caused the damage, the situation becomes even more complicated. Under the Outer Space Treaty, private entities cannot conduct space activities without authorization and continuing supervision from a state party. In practice, this means that private space companies operate under the regulatory authority of the National Space Agency of the country in which they are incorporated or from which they launch. SpaceX is supervised by the United States government. ISPACE's Japanese missions are supervised by the Japanese government. Blue Origin is supervised by the United States. But the degree to which national space agencies have regulatory tools to require their commercial licensees to protect foreign historical artifacts on the lunar surface is, at best, uncertain. The United States has taken some steps in this direction. The Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015 created a framework for authorizing and supervising commercial space activities, and the regulations that have developed under this framework do include provisions for protecting heritage sites. The Federal Aviation Administration, which issues licenses for commercial lunar landings, has required applicants to identify and plan for the avoidance of historically sensitive areas. But these requirements apply only to American companies launching from American territory. They have no legal force over any other nation's commercial sector or any foreign government space program. This is the core of the problem, and it is worth staying with it for a moment, because it reveals something important about the architecture of international law and the limits of what any single nation can achieve through unilateral action, however well-intentioned. The United States would very much like to protect the Apollo sites. It has said so explicitly, repeatedly, through official channels. It has developed guidelines and best practices and recommended exclusion zones, but it cannot make those recommendations binding on anyone else. The legal tools that would allow it to do so, territorial sovereignty, treaty obligations, binding international regulations with enforcement mechanisms, are precisely the tools that the Outer Space Treaty removed from the table in 1967 in order to prevent any single nation from claiming the moon for itself. The paradox is almost elegant in its structure. The treaty that protects the moon from being owned by anyone also prevents the creation of the kind of enforceable legal authority that would be needed to protect the artifacts of the moon from damage. There is a deeper dimension to this story, though, one that goes beyond the specific legal technicalities to a more fundamental question about what we think we are doing in space and what we owe to the history of how we got there. Because the Outer Space Treaty, for all its limitations, was built on a philosophical premise that was genuinely remarkable for its time, and that remains genuinely remarkable now. The premise is expressed most clearly in Article 1, which states that the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. The province of all mankind. This phrase, written into the foundational document of space law in 1967, carries an enormous weight. It means that the moon is not American or Soviet or Chinese or Indian or the property of any other nation or combination of nations. It is the province of all mankind. All of us, every person alive, every person who has ever lived, every person who will ever live. The footprints of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in the dust of the Sea of Tranquility are not American property in any meaningful sense. They are a record of what humanity did when it first left its home planet. They belong to the human story in the same way that the paintings in the caves at Lascaux belong to the human story, not to France, not to the descendants of the people who painted them, not to any specific community or nation or institution, but to all of us. And the legal vacuum that leaves them unprotected is in a way an honest expression of that premise, even if it is an uncomfortable and potentially dangerous one. Because if the moon is the province of all mankind, then no single nation has the authority to set the rules for what happens there. And if no single nation has that authority, then the rules can only come from genuine international agreement, which is hard, which is slow, which is contested, which is precisely the kind of process that is difficult to move fast enough to keep pace with the current acceleration of lunar activity. The Artemis Accords represent the most significant recent attempt to build that international agreement. Launched by NASA in 2020, the Artemis Accords are a set of bilateral agreements between the United States and partner nations, establishing norms of behavior for lunar exploration. They include provisions specifically addressing the protection of heritage sites, committing signatory nations to the preservation of artifacts and evidence of activities on the moon and other celestial bodies. As of 2024, more than 40 nations have signed the Artemis Accords, including major spacefaring nations like Japan, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, India, and many others. But China has not signed. Russia has not signed. And China and Russia are the two other nations with active lunar programs of the most serious capability. China's Chang'e missions have already demonstrated a level of technical sophistication that puts China firmly in the first tier of lunar exploration capability. And China's stated plans for lunar exploration in the coming decades are ambitious and detailed. Russia's renewed lunar program, after the decades of dormancy that followed the end of the Soviet space program, is more uncertain in its current status, but Russia's historical investment in lunar exploration technology and its stated interest in eventual lunar resource utilization make it a party whose absence from the Artemis framework is significant. The Artemis Accords are not a treaty, they are bilateral agreements, entered into individually by each signatory nation with the United States. They do not have the status of binding international law in the way that the Outer Space Treaty does. They are an expression of shared values and intentions, a statement of how the signatory nations believe lunar activities should be conducted. They are not enforceable against non-signatories, and even among signatories the mechanisms of enforcement are limited. But they represent a real and meaningful step toward the kind of international consensus that protecting the Apollo sites, and more broadly managing the moon as a shared resource, ultimately requires. The protection of heritage sites is one provision among many in the Artemis Accords framework. The Accords also address the question of resource extraction, the ability of private companies and national programs to extract and use lunar resources like water ice and metals, a question that is of enormous commercial importance and considerable legal uncertainty. The Outer Space Treaty says that no nation can own the moon, but it says nothing specific about whether a nation or a company can extract and own resources from the moon. The Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015 asserted that American citizens have the right to own resources they extract from celestial bodies, without claiming sovereignty over the celestial body itself. The legal logic is that you can own what you dig up without owning the ground you dug it from, similar to how a fishing vessel can own the fish it catches without owning the ocean. Whether this logic is valid under the Outer Space Treaty is contested by other nations and by legal scholars, and the Artemis Accords reflect the American position, while explicitly noting that this remains an area of ongoing international discussion. This distinction between ownership of a place and ownership of what you extract from a place matters enormously for the future of the moon. Because if the moon can be mined for resources that can be owned and sold, then the economic incentives driving lunar activity will be vastly greater than if the moon is purely a destination for scientific exploration. And vastly greater economic incentives mean vastly greater activity. And vastly greater activity means vastly greater potential for interference with the Apollo sites and everything else that humanity has left on the lunar surface. There is also a question of scale that is easy to lose sight of when we focus on the Apollo landing sites as discrete locations. The moon is large. It is a world in itself, smaller than the Earth, but larger than any planet we have yet discovered orbiting another star that we have been able to characterize in detail. Its surface area is approximately 38 million square kilometers, comparable to the total land area of Africa. On a world of that size, even a significant increase in the number of missions would leave vast areas untouched. The Apollo 11 landing site in the Sea of Tranquility is a speck on the surface of the moon, and the nearest area of intense commercial interest, the lunar South Pole, is roughly the same distance away from the Sea of Tranquility as New York is from London. But the moon is not uniformly interesting. The areas of greatest scientific interest and greatest commercial potential are specific and limited. Water ice concentrations are found in permanently shadowed craters near the poles. Specific types of valuable minerals are concentrated in specific geological formations. The most stable and energy-efficient areas for a permanent crewed outpost are limited by the requirements of adequate sunlight for solar power and access to water ice and protection from radiation. These constraint-satisfying locations are not randomly distributed across the lunar surface. They are specific, identifiable, limited. And the same logic that concentrates commercial and scientific interest in specific locations on Earth, creating cities, ports, resource extraction sites, at particular geographic points where the combination of conditions is favorable, will concentrate lunar activity in specific locations on the moon. The Apollo sites are not in those locations, as we noted. But the principle is broader than the specific question of whether a mining operation will accidentally bulldoze the Eagle descent stage. The principle is about what kind of governance framework is adequate for managing a shared extraterrestrial resource that an increasing number of actors are competing to use. To see why this question is so urgent, it helps to look at an analogy from Earth, one that is imperfect, like all analogies, but that illuminates the essential dynamics. Antarctica. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 established a framework for managing a continent that no nation owns, using it for peaceful purposes and scientific research, prohibiting military activity and resource exploitation, protecting it as a kind of global commons. The Antarctic Treaty was negotiated at a moment when the major powers had incentive to agree on rules, because the alternative, a competitive race to claim Antarctic territory, would have created serious geopolitical instability during the Cold War. The treaty has been remarkably durable and remarkably successful, though it faces increasing pressure as global warming opens up Antarctic resources and as more nations develop the capability to operate in the region. The moon could have something like an Antarctic treaty. The Outer Space Treaty was intended to be that framework, and in its foundational principles it succeeded in establishing the basic premise: no national sovereignty, peaceful purposes, the moon as the province of all mankind. What it failed to create was the detailed management framework that the Antarctic Treaty contains, the specific rules and institutions and procedures that translate the high principles into operational reality. The window for creating that detailed management framework through genuine multilateral negotiation may be narrowing. The current trajectory of space development, with its competition between American and Chinese visions for the future of the moon, its proliferation of private actors with substantial resources and minimal investment in the existing international order, and its acceleration driven by the prospect of significant commercial returns from lunar resources, is creating facts on the ground that will become increasingly difficult to reverse. Nations and companies that establish infrastructure on the moon, that build outposts and extract resources and create supply chains and develop the kind of operational presence that implies ongoing commitment, will accumulate the kind of de facto authority that is difficult to challenge even in the absence of de jure sovereignty. The history of terrestrial colonialism is relevant here, uncomfortably relevant. The legal doctrines that European powers used to justify their claims to territories in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific frequently worked by distinguishing between the right to extract and use resources, which the colonizing powers asserted they had, and the formal sovereignty they were simultaneously claiming over the territory. The legal fiction of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, was used to justify the annexation of territories that were in fact inhabited and managed by people who did not organize their relationship to land in ways that European legal frameworks recognized. The parallel with the moon is not perfect, because the moon actually is uninhabited and does not contain peoples whose rights are being violated by the arrival of space programs. But the structure of the argument, that presence and use creates a kind of effective authority that eventually hardens into formal rights, is worth keeping in mind. The Apollo 11 descent stage sits in the Sea of Tranquility as a physical emblem of all of these questions. It is legally owned by the United States, which means it cannot be claimed by anyone else. It is sitting on ground that belongs to no one, which means the United States cannot exclude others from the vicinity. It is historically significant to all of humanity, which means its protection is in principle the responsibility of everyone, which in practice means no one has a clear obligation to protect it. It is physically vulnerable to the activities of future missions, which are coming whether or not there is a legal framework adequate to manage their interaction with existing artifacts. And it will outlast all of us and all of our institutions, sitting there in the perfect preservation of the lunar vacuum for a timescale that makes our entire recorded history look like a brief afternoon. Let us be specific about the timescales involved, because they add a dimension to this story that easy to gloss over, but that is genuinely important. The moon has no atmosphere. It has no weather in the conventional sense, no wind, no rain, no frost in the temperature cycling sense, no biological activity, no chemical weathering of the kind that slowly breaks down materials on Earth. What it does have is extreme temperature swings, from about 127 degrees Celsius in full sunlight to minus 173 degrees Celsius in shadow, and the mechanical stress from repeated thermal cycling does cause materials to degrade over very long timescales. It has micrometeorite impacts, a constant slow rain of tiny particles from space, which gradually sandblast exposed surfaces. It has cosmic radiation and solar wind, which cause chemical changes in materials over long timescales. But the rate of all of these degradation processes is slow compared to anything we are familiar with on Earth. The descent stage of the Eagle, left in the Sea of Tranquility, will remain recognizable as a spacecraft for millions of years. The footprints of Armstrong and Aldrin in the regolith, the fine gray soil of the lunar surface, will remain visible for millions of years. Not preserved in the sense of museum conservation, but simply undisturbed, because the processes that would disturb them are operating at a rate so slow that millions of years of exposure will produce changes that are less significant than a single afternoon of wind on Earth. When our descendants, thousands of generations from now, return to the Sea of Tranquility, if they do, if there are descendants, if they are capable of that kind of journey, they will find it essentially as Armstrong and Aldrin left it. That perspective, the perspective of deep time, changes the weight of the question. We are not just deciding what happens to some old hardware from a 50-year-old space program. We are deciding what our species does with the first evidence of its own departure from its home world. We are deciding whether the moment of maximum expansion in human history, the moment when, for the first time, human beings stood on ground that was not of the Earth, is treated as something worth protecting, something worth maintaining the integrity of, or whether it is treated as an obstacle to industrial activity, an inconvenience to be noted and filed and eventually disregarded. There is a useful parallel in the history of terrestrial heritage protection. In the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution was transforming the landscapes of Europe and North America with a speed and thoroughness that had no historical precedent, there was a growing awareness that things of irreplaceable value were being lost. Landscapes that had existed in the same form for centuries were being changed in years. Buildings of historical and architectural significance were being demolished to make way for new development. Objects of cultural significance were being dispersed and destroyed because no one had thought to create mechanisms for protecting them. The response, slow and imperfect and still ongoing, was the development of heritage protection as a legal and institutional concept. National parks, heritage registries, preservation laws, international conventions like the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. These mechanisms are imperfect. They have been applied unevenly, and sometimes in ways that reflect the priorities and prejudices of the institutions doing the designating, rather than a genuinely universal assessment of value. But their existence has made a difference. Places and objects and landscapes that would otherwise be gone are still here because someone decided they were worth protecting and created a mechanism to do so. The question for the moon is whether we can get ahead of the industrial transformation this time, rather than responding to it after the damage has been done. Whether we can create the governance frameworks before the activity that they are meant to govern is already underway, at a scale that makes the frameworks difficult to enforce. Whether we can learn from the experience of managing global commons on Earth, the oceans, the atmosphere, the deep seabed, the electromagnetic spectrum, and apply those lessons to the newest and most extreme of global commons. The people who are thinking most carefully about these questions are a small community of space lawyers, policy scholars, space historians, and advocacy organizations who have been working on this problem for longer than most people have been aware that it is a problem. Organizations like the For All Moonkind nonprofit, which has been specifically focused on protecting Apollo-era heritage sites and has been advocating for a more robust international framework for doing so for years. Scholars like Michelle Hanlon, who has argued for treating the lunar landing sites as World Heritage Sites, even without formal UNESCO designation, through the development of alternative international instruments. People like Beth O'Leary, an archaeologist at New Mexico State University, who has been studying the Apollo sites as archaeological sites and making the case that the discipline of space archaeology is not a curiosity, but a genuine and necessary field of study as human activities in space accelerate. Their arguments converge on a few key points. First, that the existing legal framework of the Outer Space Treaty, while foundational and important, was not designed to address the specific challenges of protecting heritage sites on the Moon, and must be supplemented by additional international instruments to do so effectively. Second, that the window for creating those instruments is narrowing as the pace of lunar activity increases and as the gap between the current capability of the spacefaring nations and the regulatory frameworks governing their activities grows wider. Third, that the protection of the Apollo sites is not just an American interest, but a genuinely universal interest, because those sites represent the heritage of all humanity, and their protection is the responsibility of all humanity. The complication, and it is a genuine complication, is that these arguments are being made in a political environment in which the international cooperation necessary to translate them into binding law is very difficult to achieve. The relationship between the United States and China, which would need to be the central axis of any serious multilateral moon governance framework, is currently among the most fraught in the world. The relationship between the United States and Russia is worse. The Artemis Accords, for all their merits, represent a specifically American approach to moon governance that China and Russia have explicitly declined to join, partly because they see the accords as an attempt by the United States to set the rules for the moon on its own terms rather than through genuinely multilateral negotiation. And from a certain perspective, that critique has some merit. The accords were drafted by the United States. They reflect American legal and policy positions on contested questions like resource extraction, and they were offered to other nations as a take-it-or-leave-it framework rather than a genuinely negotiated instrument. The alternative, a genuinely multilateral process through the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is the UN body responsible for space governance, moves more slowly and with greater difficulty because it requires consensus among a much larger and more diverse group of nations, including many that have no current space capability but have political interests in how the rules are set, and because the deliberate pace of UN treaty-making is poorly matched to the rapid development of the technology and the rapid acceleration of the activities it is trying to govern. The Outer Space Treaty took just over 2 years from initial proposal to entry into force. A new lunar governance treaty, negotiated through Copios in the current political environment, with the current complexity of interests involved, would likely take far longer, if it could be achieved at all. There is also a newer agreement to consider. The Moon Agreement of 1979, negotiated in the decade after the Outer Space Treaty, attempted to fill some of the gaps in the earlier document, specifically on the question of resource extraction, by declaring the Moon and its natural resources to be the common heritage of mankind, and by calling for the establishment of an international regime to govern the exploitation of those resources when it becomes feasible to do so. This was a more ambitious attempt to apply the common heritage concept that was also being developed for the deep seabed in the context of UNCLOS, the UN Law of the Sea Convention. The problem is that the Moon Agreement has never been ratified by any of the major spacefaring nations. The United States has not ratified it, Russia has not ratified it, China has not ratified it, Japan has not ratified it, the European space powers have not ratified it. The only nations that have ratified the Moon Agreement are a small group of states with no current space programs, and their ratification, while legally valid, does not create the practical reality of an international regime, because the nations with the actual capability to exploit lunar resources have not agreed to be bound by it. So the Moon Agreement is a treaty that says the Moon's resources are the common heritage of mankind and must be managed by an international regime, and it has been ratified by nobody who could actually implement that principle. It is a legal document floating in a void, much like the descent stage of the Eagle, present but unanchored, significant in what it represents but without the institutional embodiment that would give it practical force. The question of what to do with this situation, how to move from the current state of legal inadequacy to something more robust, is genuinely open, and genuinely important, and genuinely urgent in a way that it was not 20 years ago, when the moon was still largely a place that human civilization had visited once and then left alone. Let us come back to the specific object that anchors this whole discussion. The Eagle descent stage, the bottom half of the spacecraft that carried the first humans to the surface of another world. It is sitting in the Sea of Tranquility at approximately 0.67 degrees north latitude and 23.47 degrees east longitude in the lunar coordinate system. It weighs something over 2,000 kilograms, though in the 1/6 gravity of the moon, it would feel like a few hundred kilograms if you tried to lift it. It is made of aluminum alloy and titanium and gold foil and Kapton film and dozens of other materials that were selected for their weight and strength and thermal properties for a specific mission in 1969. Its upper surface is the descent engine cover on which Armstrong and Aldrin stood when they first stepped out onto the lunar surface. The ladder down which Armstrong descended, pausing on the last rung before making that final step, is still attached to the front of it. The plaque attached to the descent stage reads, "We came in peace for all mankind." For all mankind. The people who wrote that phrase understood, or at least aspired to express, that what was happening on July 20th, 1969 was not just an American achievement, not just a Cold War victory, not just the culmination of a 10-year program funded by the United States government. It was something larger. It was a species accomplishment, the first time any member of the species Homo sapiens had left the surface of the Earth and stood on another world. The first time any organism from the biosphere of Earth, any organism that had been shaped by 3.5 billion years of terrestrial evolution, had looked up at the Earth from somewhere else and seen it as a place, a planet among planets, distant and beautiful and finite. That moment belongs to everyone. The plaque says so. The Outer Space Treaty says so, in its declaration that space is the province of all mankind. The moral intuition of most people who have ever thought seriously about what the moon landing means says so. The moment cannot be owned. The significance of it cannot be nationalized. The achievement cannot be privatized. And yet the physical artifact of that moment, the hardware that made it possible, the machine that carried those two human beings to that specific place,